Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first discussion with that is done virtually on YouTube Live. So we're so happy to have you guys here with us tonight, and maybe if you watch it in the future, to have you watch it later too. So my name is Sarah. I am the Executive Director at the Museum on Main. That is done virtually on YouTube Live. I'm hearing some playback. And maybe if you watch it in the future, to have you watch it later. So this is our first. So my name is Sarah. I am the Executive Director at the Museum on Main. We have to figure out where that feedback is coming from. I'm hearing some playback. All right. That should have fixed it. I think we're back. Okay. Sorry about that. So one of the things I wanted to touch on is that this is the first time that we're doing it. So we're going to have potentially some little mishaps such as that. So please bear with us and let us know in the comment section on the YouTube Live. It'll be on your right-hand side. There's a place to chat, and we'll be following those things. And you can let us know if you've got questions throughout the presentation, or if you have any feedback, if something's not working, let us know. And we will try and address those issues. So again, my name is Sarah, and I'm the Director of Education at the Museum on Main. And I'm going to be introducing you to our moderator tonight, as well as our presenter. And then I'm going to hand it over to them. While the presentation is going, please do ask questions as you have them, and then we'll address those at the end. If you don't have any questions, don't worry, we've got questions that maybe you haven't even thought of that we will address at the end. So the first person I'd like to introduce you to is our moderator tonight. That is Olivia San Wang. She is our president of our Alameda County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, also known as Zone 7. Water agency, and she was first elected to Zone 7 in 2018. And she is passionate about sharing her knowledge about the agency and planning for droughts and floods. And she's also a lifelong member of this community. And she, as I know personally, is very passionate about our community, its resources, as well as our history. So we're so happy to have her moderating. So please welcome Olivia San Wang. And then we also have Ken MacLennan, who is going to be our speaker tonight. He is our curator. He has joined the museum. He joined the museum in 2008. He's written a book about Pleasanton. He's kind of our expert on Pleasanton history. Olivia has it, exactly. So he's our expert, and he loves water history. It's one of his favorite topics. It's not something really people think about, but water covers so much of our lives that it's almost running through all of the history that's happened here in Pleasanton. So I hope you all are excited. I know I'm excited to hear his talk that's specifically about water. So I'm going to turn it over to Olivia and Ken. So thank you all again for joining, and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia San Wang, and I'm so thrilled to be here with Ken in the Museum on Main and with Sarah. This is something that I always dreamed would happen. I'd say I'm one of Ken's biggest fans. I have his book here in front of me, and you'll see that most of these marks in my book are points in the book that mention water and how important water is to the development of Pleasanton and the Tri-Valley. And so I think we have such a treat in store tonight to hear from Ken. I'll be here to help field some of the questions and possibly answer some if they might be about topics regarding Zone 7 today and water today, or in our recent history. Also, I know we'll talk about this at the end of tonight's program, but we will have another one of these talks in 2 weeks where we will talk a little bit more about the present and what's happening today in terms of water planning. So without further ado, here's Ken with his amazing presentation on water history here in Pleasanton.
All right, hello everybody. I've got a little AV stuff going on here, so I'm going to switch over to share the screen, and let's get us looking at our presentation, Pleasanton Water Historical Perspective. Okay, so I want to talk about the early recorded history days of the valley. This is a map of Alameda County, 1857. This is about the earliest map that I've been able to get hold of that actually shows the features in any kind of detail. You'll notice the thing in the red circle there. That is a marsh. That is a wetland where these creeks that sort of start the Alameda Creek watershed all feed down into the Western Valley here. And up until the 1850s, this was a marsh, and then it sort of fed out south and then west through Alameda Creek to the bay. So this is basically what the valley looked like when the Spanish showed up and the MacLennan and other tribes, other Ohlone tribes were living in the valley. Now, their water use was pretty light on the land. They didn't irrigate for agriculture. They ate plants that grew naturally and maintained the landscape the way it was. They didn't herd livestock, so they didn't have a whole bunch of animals drinking water. They didn't use it for industry. They didn't have sewage systems or anything like that. So mostly it's cooking, cleaning, drinking, and any water you might need to mix pigments or in making basketry or finishing off things, anything that you use to make the things that they used in their everyday lives. And there were good years and bad years. There we go. But in general, there was a wetland there, and they relied on that also for, I'm going to go back to this a little bit. Also relied on it for things that the water came with the water or were produced by the water. The tule reeds that grew in the marsh, they relied heavily on those. The ducks and other waterfowl that would come up, that was part of their diet. So they didn't use a lot of water directly, but they did rely on the wetland for their daily lives. Then when the Spanish came, you don't really see a lot of change to the landscape, but you do start to see, well, not the waterscape anyway, but you do start to see some shifts. The Spanish bring in a lot of cows and sheep and horses, and those livestock all need to drink and they need to graze. So that the grasses in the valley become, frankly, a little bit overgrazed. There are grasses that the Spanish accidentally bring in seed for them, and they start to replace the native grasses. But as far as the watershed goes, the wetland is still there. The creeks are still there. They're not tapping it for irrigation. They're not drawing it much on wells. It's still relatively low pressure on water resources. And even when the rancheros and other homesteaders start coming in towards the end of the Mexican period and at the beginning of California statehood, yes, homesteaders dig private wells on their lands, but they're not drawing a whole lot of water off of it. Now, we start to see a big shift in 1864. Stock raising remains the main activity in the valley through the Mexican Revolution, the War of Independence, through the secularization of the missions, and even through the war with the United States and the initial takeover by the United States government of California and statehood. The people living in here are mostly ranchers. Either they are ranchero families, the old Spanish and Mexican soldiers and people who married into those families, or they are homesteaders who come in and also start raising mostly cattle, and rather than doing a lot of grain farming and things. However, in 1864, there's a huge drought, and thousands of cattle and sheep die, and a lot of the existing property owners in the area start to sell off part of their property to other people who turn around and start raising grain. And by 1870, agriculture has become more important in the valley than stock raising. And by 1880, there is definite interest in drainage projects. People are looking at that marsh and saying, we can turn that into farmland. And over the 1880s, that lake is drained. But you still don't have a lot of irrigation projects. Now, Pleasanton is more or less constructed in the mid-1860s to late 1860s. The first lots get sold by John Cottinger in 1863. The railroad is finished in 1869, and in 1868 and 1869, John Cottinger and Joshua Neal file a town plan with the county, breaking up parts of their property into lots so that they can sell to more people, because now we have a railroad. There will be a demand for a depot and a demand for businesses and other services. And for the next 30 years, it's an unincorporated town. And the water supply then is still wells. People dig wells on the streets, in front of their businesses, in front of their houses. And that's where you get your water. There are communal wells on the streets. There are water wells in front of people's houses. And that is working out fairly well until the mid 1890s, and it's one of the reasons the city's incorporated. It's not the only one, but the water issue is something that they're already talking about. It takes them 6 years to actually do something about it. And in 1901, they buy property a little bit north of town, where is now McKinley Park, dig a deeper well, and start putting in piping so that then the city will have running water. That gets water into people's homes, but it doesn't necessarily get it out of people's homes. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Part of the reason that you're starting to see drain on the water is because of the growth of San Francisco and Oakland, in particular San Francisco. Both cities are looking for, to make sure that a growing population has enough water. And San Francisco, as you can see from this map, has been, well, not San Francisco itself, we'll define this. The water company for San Francisco at this point is a private company called Spring Valley Water Company. All of those pink lands are lands that they have bought the water rights to. And you see this is San Francisco, and their reach stretches down the peninsula, around the bay, into the Amador-Livermore Valley, and into the Santa Clara Valley. And in the Amador-Livermore Valley, they've got fairly deep wells, and they're pumping this stuff out to San Francisco. And by the mid-1910s, the water table is noticeably dropping, and it's one of the primary causes of the end of the hop business in the valley. The Pleasanton Hop Company goes out of business by 1916. It sells its land to Spring Valley Water Company, and the reason they cite for having to go out of business is because the water table is dropping too low to grow hops on. And the city is also growing, and its water needs are growing. After fighting with Spring Valley Water for several years, they end up finally signing a contract for water delivery in 1916 to supplement the stuff on the that they get from the well that they dug in 1901. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Here we go. So I was going to talk about wastewater. 1901, we've got a piping system to bring water into houses and businesses. What we do not have is a system to take dirty water out of the town at all. So before incorporation, people dug outhouses, or people dug holes and built outhouses over them, and they dug cesspits, and these were open. And the laundries had cesspits practically on Main Street, and everybody noticed and everybody complained. And in order to get something done about it, that was another reason, and probably a bigger reason than the water supply, that Pleasanton voted for incorporation in 1894. Once again, it takes a little while to get things done because it costs money. You've got to raise money, you've got to do taxes or bonds. And in 1910 and 1911, they build a sewage system. And by 1918, the system is already inadequate. And there's a picture there of the treatment plant in the 1920s, where they're trying to deal with the smell with some sort of a biological breakdown method. It's not clear that it was particularly effective. Another frequent problem, recurring problem in the valley has been flooding. You're in a watershed. Basically, you live in a valley like this. You're at the bottom of a bowl. And every so often, rain and snow water is going to collect. When it's heavy, it's going to be a lot of water. And we talk about draining the laguna in the 1880s before, and that was largely about clearing land for agriculture. However, you do get periodic flooding into the 1950s. And in 1955, you have a huge flood, like a century level flood. And it pretty much covers all of Hop Yard Road, a large chunk of the valley. It's pretty scary stuff. And during the 50s, the county had established a flood control program. They started breaking this up into districts, and after rejecting a proposal to form a flood control district with the area around Niles and in Washington Township, the Livermore and Pleasanton and the other voters in the county established a separate flood control and water zone just in the valley called Zone 7 in 1957. And within 3 years, they've got a bond issue and they can start working on these drainage projects. And the first big drainage project combined an expansion, a deeper digging, a little widening, but mostly rerouting and deepening the Arroyo de la Laguna, which was that, let me go back to the 1857 map here. Uh-oh, this one. It's not showing up. Anyway, it is the slide. It is my. There we go. It's the creek that ran south from the Laguna into Alameda Creek. It was joined by the Arroyo del Valle, which is the one that crosses the north end of Main Street here, the Arroyo Mocho, and a couple others. I've gotten ahead of myself here. Here we are. So that system, which mostly involves deepening the Arroyo de la Laguna and setting up Del Valle Dam in order to create a reservoir, someplace for the water to go and to make it available for when drought hits. There's still some flooding problems, and in North Pleasanton, where it's sort of flattest and lowest, and that's the area where the marsh used to be, where the Laguna used to be. When the Hacienda project is proposed and when it starts being implemented, they further improve the drainage system as part of the general infrastructure they install in the early 80s. And while that's not the end of flooding in Pleasanton, it certainly controls it a lot better. Now we have to back up a little bit. After World War II, California in general experiences a huge population boom with largely the birth of the tech industry. And during the war, there's a naval base here, actually a naval base complex. There's a naval hospital, an induction center or transfer center, and a Seabees base in the area where Parks military base is now. And then there's the Livermore Naval Air Station in Livermore. But these bases all together bring like 40,000 people during the war at a time when the entire valley before then maybe had 10 or 12,000. And the Navy builds the infrastructure for the bases to make sure they have water, sewage system, power, all that stuff. Now, after the base closes, because the Navy gives it up, they eventually turn it over to the Air Force for a few years, and then the Air Force turns it over to the Army after a while. But after the Navy first closes it, that infrastructure is still there, and people start looking for ways to use it. Developers form a services district, which is another one of these sort of governmental organizations that's parallel to state, county, municipality, that crosses those boundaries and is purpose oriented rather than just geographically oriented. But they found this thing called the Parks Community Services District, but they're never quite able to cut a deal with the Navy to get use of the sewage and piping infrastructure and expand on that. And it just sort of stays inactive until the late 50s, when in part because of demand for fire services, for fire control services, but also a pair of developers named Folk and McLean. Sorry for the blanking there. They sketch out a plan for a large development called San Ramon Village, which crosses the boundary between Dublin and San Ramon, and which crosses the county boundaries. That is going to require a lot of infrastructure, and they are aware, because the Navy did it, that you can actually support that many people, and they put the investments in, and it's a considerable success. But it does increase use on the valley. Now to look back to Pleasanton here, from 1916 to the 1960s, Pleasanton is getting a lot of its water from San Francisco's system. They've still got that one well up at McKinley Park, but most of the water they're getting from what used to be Spring Valley Water Company. San Francisco buys it out in the 30s. And San Francisco is still looking for new water resources because they're still growing. And the final upshot of that is the proposal to dam the Hetch Hetchy Valley up in Yosemite and use it as a reservoir, running aqueducts down to San Francisco for the water, with some other off-ramps for anybody else that might need to participate. That project is approved in 1914. There's a lot of fighting about it. John Muir gets involved. You've probably heard some of this. They start building it in the 30s. The aqueduct path actually runs south of the valley here, and Pleasanton has the opportunity to purchase water from the Hetch Hetchy project, but declines. You're going to see this a little bit later also when the state develops its water project, which is largely about making sure that water gets from Northern California up around the Sacramento River Delta, San Joaquin River, down south to LA, but is also about supplying communities along the way. The Zone 7 Water District is an early customer, but Pleasanton, again, opts out. They still have a water district of their own. And in '68, they start buying water through Zone 7 to supplement what they've already got. And then a few years later, they finally dissolved the Pleasanton Township Water District, which basically served the west side of the valley, and transferred their rights to Zone 7. They're also buying some water from Valley Community Services District and contracting with them for wastewater treatment services. And through the 60s and into the early 70s, it's a period of rapid growth for the entire valley. Livermore's building heavily, Dublin San Ramon's building heavily, Pleasanton's building heavily. And by the early 70s, you're starting to hit the limits of the infrastructure. There are other problems like smog and commute traffic that are bothering people. But water hookups and to a much greater extent, wastewater issues become a problem. And in 1971, Valley Community Services District, there's somebody finds a leaky air hose and plugs it and realizes that because of the air coming out through the hose, leaking through the hose, the numbers that they have for the amount of wastewater they've been processing was underestimated by at least 500,000 gallons and perhaps 750,000 gallons a day over what's supposed to be the capacity of the system. So when this comes to the attention of the county, they slap a moratorium on hookups, and there's basically an ultimatum: you fix this or else. It takes a few years. There's a little bit of negotiation and litigation to allow some hookups for projects that have already been greenlit. But the there's a valley-wide water management agency developed specifically to deal with wastewater coming out of the valley, and they built a pipeline in the late 70s and early 80s that carries wastewater out to the bay. And for most practical intents and purposes, the problem is pretty much solved, at least in the valley. And LAVWMA is still active. They're still handling wastewater treatment in the valley. And that's as far as I can see the current end of that story. And that brings us into the 80s. There have been a few key changes in the late 70s, early 80s. When the quarry ends, and let me get out of here and go back to where I am before. Stop screen sharing, but I'm not on video. I'm not sure what happened to my picture, but anyway, as the quarries close along Stanley Avenue, they try to figure out what to do with them. And somebody floats a landfill proposal, but Zone 7 objects and says that's probably going to affect the aquifer and the water supply. And they offer a counter proposal to turn those gravel pits into reservoirs, mini reservoirs, percolation ponds. And that plan is accepted, and now that's why we have the water, the ponds out on Stanley now. Okay, I am not sure, and I'm a little thrown off by what has happened with the screen here. But that basically brings me to the end of my presentation. And if Olivia, oh.
If you're done, it's okay if you don't.
I'm done, yeah. So there we go. Thank you. Moderator.
Yes, so we had one question from Jim about McKinley Park, and I was just going to say it's at 519 Cottinger Drive.
Okay.
I'll send that into the YouTube live chat for all to see. I was trying to get a good link, but it was difficult to find a good link on the City of Pleasanton website. So we will maybe not have a link, or I'll see if I can find a link for later. As far as questions go, I don't know if there are any other questions for those who are watching on YouTube Live. We are monitoring that chat area for you to submit your questions. Without those questions, I have a question, Ken.
Ask away, Olivia.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more about your research into the history. Recently you and I met with the students from the Go Green initiative to talk a little bit about some of your research. And you had some really good comments about how water's been this through line, how you sort of stumbled upon water as this through line. Like when you first set out to write the history of Pleasanton, maybe you thought it was possible water would be this through line, but it wasn't until you dug deep into the research that you really saw that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process and when that, light bulb turned on when you said, aha, it looks like this is really that, driving story throughout, the development of Pleasanton.
Well, I knew that I was going to have to discuss infrastructure and start looking at the development of infrastructure as part of development of any town. Things like when do the streets get paved, when do you get running water, when do you get electrical, how these things get built in and the process for doing so. But one thing I noticed as I was looking through the newspapers and the books and all the other things that have been written about it was that water kept showing up as an issue of conflict. And anytime you get a recurring conflict theme, you got a story. And it seemed to be, to me, the most common theme or the most common source of conflict in the story of Pleasanton and in the story of the Valley was issues about water supply, issues about wastewater treatment. We had people who wouldn't hook up to the system in the teens, and Philip Kolb, who owned the store that became Dean's Cafe, owned a saloon. They yanked his liquor license because he wouldn't hook up to the water system or to the sewage system.
Interesting.
So when these things kept popping up, I was saying, okay, this is something to pay attention to. And then I started looking for it. And one of the major resources, it's a secondary, it's not really a source, that I ran across in researching the book was a dissertation by a guy named Douglas Greenberg about development politics in the Valley for the second half of the 20th century, basically from the 50s into the 80s. And that covers a lot of the water stuff too, especially the wastewater treatment and the conflicts over growth, which were connected to the water issues, but not entirely driven by them. And probably really were more driven by things like pollution, the desire for open space, and probably property values than other things, or than water supplies and wastewater treatment. So that's pretty much my answer to that question. I see we have a question.
We do, yes. I'll read the question from Tom Daggett. Hello, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Based on current infrastructure and population projections, how secure is our water in the future?
That's a question for Olivia.
I believe that's a question for me, yes. And I can say, at Zone 7, certainly we take water reliability planning and planning for the possibility of droughts as well as floods very seriously. This is the mission of the Zone 7 Water Agency. And in terms of water supply, in particular, we live here in California where we are in drought conditions more often than not. So we have to plan for drought. We have to plan for mega droughts, which we all just recently experienced in the last 10 years. So hopefully that's still within our own recent memory. And so in terms of water supply, we have a number of projects at Zone 7 that we are looking into and supporting and participating in. And so some of the projects include, one reservoir project, Sites Reservoir, which is north of the Delta, which will capture excess water from the Sierra Mountains and from the river system north of the Delta. So that Sites Reservoir is one of them. Another one nearby, Los Vaqueros, right on the Contra Costa County, Alameda County border in Brentwood, in Contra Costa County and managed by the Contra Costa Water District, is another project we're looking at, and that will help us in terms of storage as well as creating an intertie with other East Bay agencies. And that's one that's incredibly close to our service area, and it's one that I'm really excited about personally. We also, within this age, going through this mega drought, when we had no snow on the Sierra Mountains, our water supply is currently very dependent on snow in the Sierra Mountains. And when there is no snow, that does then force us to rely on our groundwater. And our groundwater aquifer, we are very fortunate here in the Tri-Valley to have a major aquifer. I know Ken talked a little bit about this in his presentation. It's certainly something that's mentioned in his book. And in 2014, in the middle of that mega drought that we had recently, there's some legislation passed by through the leadership of Governor Jerry Brown, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Authority Act, SGMA. And Zone 7 is the SGMA appointed leader here in the Tri-Valley region. So we manage our sustainable groundwater here. And through that, we do have a system where when we have excess surface water from the Delta, we will artificially inject that into our aquifer to help increase the supply. And so then when we do have drought conditions, we might be able to pump extra water from the ground to meet water demand. And some of these topics I'll actually be covering in 2 weeks. So this is a good segue for that. We will have another talk through this waterways series here at the Museum on Main. And I know Sarah will share a little bit about it, but what I'm answering now is going to give you a preview of what I'll talk about. And, I'll leave this answer with two final thoughts. There's a lot of new, I wouldn't even say emerging because these have been around for a while, but there are two technologies that we're also exploring at Zone 7, both using reverse osmosis. There is the desalination. There's a Bay Area regional desalination using ocean water and turning that into drinking water. And through my role at Zone 7, I had the opportunity to actually visit and tour the Poseidon desalination plant in Carlsbad, north of San Diego. It's the largest desalination plant on the West Coast. And I personally am very intrigued by this technology. And it's something that's used throughout the Middle East where there isn't a lot of available drinking water. And so it's a proven technology there's some trade-offs, of course, with everything. And some of the trade-offs with desalination are that it is very energy intensive and there is quite a bit of waste involved. And so we would have to, weigh those trade-offs. But of course, thinking about salt water, there's so much ocean water available for us being here on the Pacific coast or near the Pacific coast, and it would be a regional partnership with other Bay Area communities. The other reverse osmosis program that we're exploring is potable reuse, and that's the wastewater recycling. And so it's the same technology as desalination, so some of the similar trade-offs in terms of energy and waste are things to consider. And I believe, being good stewards of our water supply, we have to explore all of our options so that when we think about our water security in the future, our water reliability, those are the programs we're exploring. In terms of plans for new water reservoirs, so that would really be, and this is another question from Tom, that would be Sites Reservoir really is where we're going to see that increase in supply and availability for us directly here in the Tri-Valley region within the Zone 7 service area. But Los Vaqueros would also be another storage opportunity. So that would increase our availability in terms of storage. Going on the other extreme, so that's talking about our water supply and managing for a drought. Jim is asking about another flood downtown. So, I want to do a big picture. Mid-July, there was an excellent report that was released talking about the increase in variability in regards to rainfall or the lack thereof here in California, and that we need to anticipate that we're going to actually have more of these extreme weather events, in the next 50 years here in California. So either we're going to have a lot of rain or we're going to have no rain, and we need to be ready for both. And so lucky for us at Zone 7, that's what we do. And so in terms of another flood downtown, I think when we think about climate change and this anticipated increase in variability, in terms of flooding, we do our best to model the way the water is going to flow throughout the Tri-Valley region. And definitely we utilize the arroyos for managing the excess water. And then also, there's programs in place in parts of the Tri-Valley, such as Hacienda Business Park, the large parking lots at some of the commercial buildings in Hacienda Business Park have been designed to take overflow of water should there be a major flood event. And there are other pockets throughout the Tri-Valley that are designed that way to take some of that overflow. One of the other things in terms of flooding downtown Pleasanton specifically, and I do live one block from the museum, so I'm very familiar with when we get a lot of rain and what happens. Something as simple as clearing the storm drains of leaves and other debris can actually help prevent flooding downtown. And I do believe, from what I've seen personally, the city of Pleasanton has done such a great job. They're the ones who are tasked with making sure those storm drains downtown are cleared. And I think that helps prevent some of the smaller buildups of water when we have a huge rain event. But could we have another flood downtown, Jim? At my core, I studied mathematics and probabilities, and I never say never. There's always a chance for everything. But I can assure you that both the city of Pleasanton with the storm drain program, as well as Zone 7 with our flood control programs, we're doing everything we can to make sure downtown Pleasanton and other parts of the Tri-Valley do not experience major floods. But of course, we can't control the weather, and it's very difficult to predict these extreme events. So I think there's always that chance of some major rain event, and just hopefully we'll be ready for it if it happens. Tom, are there any concerns about water quality? Well, water quality is another core issue at Zone 7, and water quality can mean many things. I know right now, and I actually printed this out because I had a feeling this might come up. I know right now we do have an unprecedented algal bloom upstream from us, where there's a lot of algae in the surface water, and the treatment does involve a number of chemicals, which when it comes out of our faucet, sometimes it does create some taste and odor sensitivities. One of the other things that we're monitoring both at the state level, the Department of Water Resources and Zone 7, is MIB and geosmin. And geosmin is an organic compound. It naturally is found in surface water. And it actually, I looked this up because, you know, I'm a big trivia fan, and I think a lot of people that are listening to the Museum on Main tonight have probably also enjoyed trivia and fun facts. Geosmin is Greek for earth odor. And it's very similar to that distinct way the earth smells after it rains. And it comes in part from bacteria in the soil that releases a chemical odorant called geosmin. And the human nose is very sensitive to it. But in terms of toxicity and harm, geosmin is not toxic and not harmful. And so we are using chemicals right now to help you know, combat and to help fight some of the taste and odor. And I'm also really excited to share that just this week, we had our virtual ribbon cutting for the Del Val Water Treatment Plant ozonation project. And that's where we're using the ozonation technology in place of chemicals to help, you know, improve our water quality in regards to taste and odor. And so as that starts to come online, I hope that we'll all see a difference. I know we've spent a lot of money, a lot of our ratepayer money to build this ozonation plant. And so please, you know, keep an eye open for when we issue the press releases and have that information coming out. Okay, Larry Annis, I'm going to read your question as you write it, as you wrote it. Many people complain about the Pleasanton water quality being hard. How would you rate the quality of the water? So within the city of Pleasanton, what Zone 7 is we are the water wholesaler. So we provide majority of the water to the city of Pleasanton. Last I heard, it's somewhere between 70 to 75% of the city of Pleasanton's water comes from Zone 7. And then the remainder comes from the city of Pleasanton itself, where the city of Pleasanton does have a right to pump groundwater using their own wells. And some of those wells are located at places like right near Alice South Elementary School here in Pleasanton, as well as other spots throughout the city of Pleasanton. And with that groundwater, sometimes the water can be a bit more it can be described as hard. And the one thing to keep in mind about hard water is that it's not dangerous. However, there are some things that we have to monitor in terms of the quality of water. And what I'd like to do is maybe end that answer here and encourage people to join us in 2 weeks. And certainly we can explore a little bit more of this topic in depth. But in terms of the water quality reports, both the city of Pleasanton and Zone 7 do issue an annual water quality report where all of the laboratory testing information is included and all of the requirements that we receive both by the state of California and the Environmental Protection Agency from our federal government. You know, we track against those requirements for drinking water to make sure that you know, we're meeting all the standards and also, you know, doing our best to exceed those standards as well. And I believe, you know, meeting those requirements means that we have good quality water. All right.
All right.
Sarah,
I'm back.
she's back.
I was here all along. So are there any final thoughts or questions or comments that either of you would like to make as we, I know because we're leaning into our next presentation.
Yes, we are. I had a feeling that might be the case.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I've got
but you want to also know about what's going on now.
I have a little advertising I'd like to do myself. Those of you who follow us on Facebook may know that we've been doing an ongoing video tour of the Waterways exhibit, which is the framework for this presentation and next week's as well. So I'd like to encourage people to check out those videos and see the exhibit that we can't show you in person yet because of the virus running around. And we'll be posting a new one next Tuesday. And also on Saturday, there'll be another Water Day photograph post, another little image from Pleasanton's water history. So go to Facebook and look for those.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for bringing that up. We have this amazing show about water. So everything we're doing right now is all focused on water. So our programming, our Facebook posts, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Saturday are specifically focused on water. So we really do encourage you, like Ken said, to to keep involved with us on our Facebook, on our YouTube, and check out our website too. We're posting content there as well. So thank you, Ken, for making sure we say that. Anything else? All right. Well, what I want to do now is just we've kind of already had a teaser because Olivia's been sharing some of responding to some of the questions that relate more heavily to today's issues and quality and everything that's going on around water today. But she is going to be doing her presentation August 12th at 6:30, same thing as today. Get on YouTube Live. We'll be here talking to you, specifically Olivia Well. And her presentation is called Water Supply and Demand in the Tri-Valley region. So I think that's going to cover a lot of those burning questions that you have about water and your water resources. So be sure to check that out. Again, it will be YouTube Live just like this. And we will be going live at 6:30 on August 12th. And then on August 15th, we will also have the Go Green initiative. They will be screening their movie. So also keep that on your radar. It's going to be kind of a movie that combines Ken's presentation and Olivia's presentation with a lot of oral histories and interviews and documentation and research. So, and this has been done by high school students and recently graduated high school students. And so it'd be really great if we could all join and support them for their screening on August 15th. So put both of those on your calendars, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Ken, so much for your time. And we'll see you all soon. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.